Okay, everybody. This is covering some of week 4 chapters. We have some separate videos that are going to be delineated on our module. So just take a look at it. There's going to be a video about the media, World War II, the Cold War, the Great Depression, and the Electoral College. So I think with this video here, I'm going to include the media and the Electoral College and World War II, the Great Depression, and the Cold War are going to be covered under videos that I've already made. Not much has changed. So, it's no sense in reinventing the wheel. So, some of these things that we're going to talk about in political science change constantly. So, I don't really like using previous videos. So, I try to do as accurate as possible. And so, today's recording date is June 19th. We're still a couple of weeks away from this chapter as I record, so obviously things might have changed slightly in some of our stuff, but just keep in mind of that date. So we're going to talk about the media and the media's influence on politics, and one of the questions this week is going to be about TMZ and how TMZ serves maybe as a resource for people here in the United States as far as getting their news. So the people that control the news are among the most powerful people in our country, whether it's Rupert Murdoch, Les Moonves, Disney. All these people that control media can also see themselves as a active participant in politics. They can, in a sense, report disasters, report events, give us meanings to events, determine what's important, and it's at times challenge government officials and define what might be the problems in society. If you look at this link, this is going to show how most of the masses get their news. I'm going to go ahead and spoil this for you. Most of the masses get their news from mobile devices. And that's, something that's kind of been in vogue in the past 4 or 5 years that, I have Channel 10 News here in San Diego. I have notifications that they send when certain news events happen. Some people might have CNN, some people might have Fox, some people might have MSNBC. But for the most part, we all use kind of our mobile devices to get our news. When we talk about the media and kind of the myth of the mirror, part of our media elites claim that, their actions simply mirror reality. And the media has the power to elevate some national issues and ignore others, elevate obscure people, and reward some politicians. And we look at Twitter, and then we usually can see people saying, well, why isn't this news? There might be some instances where the news media might repress certain stories. There's some instances where the news media might also kind of push up stories that we may not think are as important. And people as well. We have obscure people who are elevated. I didn't know what a Kardashian was until the O.J. Simpson case, right, in 1995, 96. And now they're part of our everyday lexicon, right? If we look at 2020, here are the newspapers with the biggest circulations. Now, I couldn't get a real definition on what these numbers involved. Was this home delivery, or were these a home delivery included in people going out and buying a paper at a newsstand or Starbucks or whatever? And I understand now Starbucks isn't really selling newspapers anywhere. So what I guess this is trying to come out of this is that we look at these numbers, we can see a lot of these papers are located in highly populated areas like New York, LA, Chicago, DC, which isn't really that populated, but outside DC, Virginia, Maryland, kind of that Beltway area is a lot of people. So it's kind of like might be a little bit misleading, but let's just take a look at it and understand that USA Today has the largest readership, and obviously this isn't counting hits on websites either, because that number would be bigger. I guess we're just talking per circulation here. What are the functions of the media? They decide what and who are newsworthy, what's allocated TV time and space accordingly. They can create events, issues, personalities, much like what we just talked about. They can also interpret the news, give news meaning. Newsmakers provide the masses with explanations and meanings for events and personalities. This is done through news specials like Dateline, or maybe there was an old show that I used to watch when I was younger, 2020. I'm not quite sure if it's on anymore, but it used to be a news program, some very, very interesting stuff that was put on. And then we have our traditional ideological talk shows like Carlson, Hannity, Rachel Maddow, which kind of push across more of an ideology as opposed to, in essence, news stories. The news media can also socialize us. They teach us what the elites' preferred political norms and values are through news and entertainment, and we pretty much can understand which candidate is going to be for what issue and how they handle and all of that. Social media has also become a very, very important tool in not only news making but also campaigning. When we talk about campaigns and elections, we're going to talk about the influence that social media has on it, and it's a very, very profound influence now. Blogs, individual run websites, do have an effect, but I think if we would rank stuff in order, it would be, for the most part, social media, things like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, that can reach a wide variety of audience in a short amount of time. And the best thing about these things are they're free, right? You can still have blogs, or like what a lot of people call now vlogs, where they, upload a video to YouTube and use it as a way to influence people. Websites can cost money, just for the hosting and the maintenance. But for the most part, a lot of our socialization comes through social media. The news can also persuade us how to feel a certain way, right? This occurs when government or corporations, what we learned about in interest groups chapter, corporations, unions, parties, they can all make attempts to affect people's beliefs, attitudes, or behavior. And we see this through commercials or maybe talk shows or stuff like that, where we have campaigns that are showing what might be the concerns of the candidates, and in a sense also trying to influence the masses on how to act. And there's a time where the candidates used to really rely on the news media to help push their message across. Let me back, that's what's happening now. Before, they used to really use the party, right? The party would spread the messages, but now there is an increasingly reliance on the news media and social media to provide that conduit between the candidate and the voter. They can also set the agenda, and this is probably the most powerful tool that they have. They can decide what is newsworthy and what is not. They can keep news stories out, and they can also make sure news stories get addressed. Political elites decide on solutions to the problem, while media elites are going to determine what those problems are. So when we talk about, kind of the picture of the United States here in the news media, in TV shows, there's an overwhelmingly bias toward negative stories here in the United States. And we like bad news. Bad news is good news. Good news doesn't stir audience interest. Bad news will sell papers. Bad news will get ratings. And, entertainment programs, things like maybe like CSI or Law and Order, or some of these programs on entertainment programs reinforce the negative picture of life in the U.S. Murder is the least common crime here in the world, but it's the far most common crime on TV. Traditionally, we've had instances where reputable newspapers haven't reported on the sex lives of political figures. Today, it's no limits, and I think we can trace that all the way back to the Clinton administration. Now, whether or not that matters to voters, that's a whole other story, right? But what we could see is that entertainment has become progressively sex-obsessed and profanity-ridden. We could talk about morals, and we could talk about what should be on TV and what shouldn't be on TV, and what should be regulated and what should not be regulated. But for the most part, I think what we could figure out is that we look with, real stories. The sex lives of the candidates aren't as important as it used to be. And I think now, people can use that as an argument to maybe vote for the candidate that has better morals, or morals that might align with you. But it's not as important as we used to have it. A lot of the time, some of this issues and some of these things that come out on TV, such as scandal and corruption, can cause us to lose trust in government, and it creates kind of a television malaise where we have a cynicism toward government. And while mainstream violence and sex may be an expression of freedom under the First Amendment, it ignores the freedom of persons who must now live in a society where we have, brutality glorified and denigration of women glorified. So, it can create that sense of malaise, or that sense of lack of confidence or trust in governments, in the institutions that the government represents. Let's go ahead and go to this. This is all self-explanatory, so we're not going to go too in depth in this. One big portion of our media is the Hollywood liberals, right? And these are actors or actresses or maybe news personalities that have a liberal bias toward news. Hollywood plays an important role in socializing young people to the political world. And these people are more likely to be Democrat than Republican. And it's something that is pretty widely known. And, we've had instances where there has been situations where maybe personalities like DiCaprio or Ben Affleck or Taylor Swift have come out and made statements in support of a candidate, and that's really going to have some weight, and it's really going to might motivate that person in the middle who doesn't know who to vote for yet. This is another thing that I want to talk about. It's called no prior restraint. Freedom of the press has been interpreted to mean the government may not censor items. If the government wants to keep military secret, the best thing is to make sure that they don't get in the hands of the news media or in the hands of somebody that could dump them on a website like WikiLeaks. So if the government wants to keep military secret, they need to make sure it doesn't fall into the hands of the wrong people. Now, am I for censoring news? Absolutely not. But are there things that we are probably better off not knowing? I think that's something that's fair to say. Like if there's something that affects military or national security, obviously I don't think we as the people need to know about it unless it could potentially be a scandal or something. Now we have some things that aren't protected by the First Amendment as far as the news media. Libel and slander. Libel is written, slander is spoken, and these are falsehoods that are made about people that could create a negative effect to their reputation, and these aren't protected by the First Amendment. And in order for these to be constitutional or to be allowable, there has to be an absence of malice. There is something called the Sullivan Rule, and there's a court case called New York Times versus Sullivan where the actual malice standard requires that the plaintiff in a defamation or a libel case must be able to show that the statements made by the other side were false and acted in reckless disregard of its truth or falsity. So basically, this really puts a high burden on the plaintiff to prove that the defendant's intentions were done with malice. Sometimes it's hard to prove, and public figures will rarely prevail in these situations. The internet has also become a major source of news, particularly for younger people and more educated people, like we talked about. As of July 2017, the internet has a penetration rate of 88.5%. I checked some figures for July 2020, and it was roughly the same, even though I think it's still a little bit understated. I wouldn't be surprised if it is up to 95%, but I couldn't find anything to substantiate that. The news media isn't the only way government agencies can provide services to people. Federal agencies maintain websites which might give information about certain things, might give you the ability to pay fees, might give you the ability to, do some type of research. But what we can truly say is that the internet cannot be restricted. There was something called the Communications Decency Act of 1996, and this attempted to outlaw indecent and offensive material on the internet. This was declared unconstitutional in 1997, and it basically says that the government can't limit the adult population to consume what is only fit for children. So basically, what it's saying is the government cannot censor the internet. And when we talk about obscenities and stuff like that, we'll go into it in a little bit more detail in a future class, because there's going to be some tests that you could put material through to see whether it's indecent or not. But we do have a bureaucracy that checks on whether or not something is considered to be indecent. The Federal Communications Commission is an independent agency or a bureaucracy that will show. Hold on, I lost it real quick. That will regulate interstate communication by radio, television, wire, satellite, and cable. Like I said, this is part of the executive branch, and it's bureaucracy where the head is appointed by the president. They monitor free airwaves. There's a gentleman named Howard Stern who had a radio show on over-the-air radio from 1990 to 2004. He was issued a fines totaling $2.5 million. And again, it could be very subjective, right? Something that might not be offensive to you might be offensive to me. Janet Jackson, Justin Timberlake, during a Super Bowl performance in 2004, Jackson's breast was exposed for 9/16 of a second. Right? CBS fined CBS $550,000 for that. This was eventually overturned by the Supreme Court. And a 5-second delay is now required to be on all live performances. Saving Private Ryan, which is actually one of my favorite movies of all time. Traditionally, this was played on Veterans Day on November 11th. In the wake of the Jackson Timberlake incident, television stations were afraid to air the movie unedited. It has a lot of foul language and a lot of violent war images. Finally, the FCC later decided that the movie was not obscene, and stations were able to play it on air unedited. We talk about politics in the internet. Social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, all have an immense amount of influence, and they've kind of taken over the link between the candidate and the voter, as opposed to the party being the link between the candidate and the voter. A lot of these coverages of news and presidential races or Senate races or House of Representative races kind of lead to something called horse race reporting. We always know who's ahead, who's behind. And a lot of negative coverage. And we also have things like shrinking sound bites, which is the average sound bite is about 8 seconds, And, you can't get really good context out of an 8-second soundbite. So it's something that needs to be, kind of taken into account when you hear these. We have late night laughs, things like SNL, Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, and then we also have, maybe for the younger voters, things like The Daily Show and Last Week Tonight, which are not late night, but they have a very good influence on how people think and how people look at politics. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at World War II. So the Cold War is going to be addressed on a separate video, all right? But it's going to be on the same PowerPoint. So World War II, or the Second World War, was a global war that lasted from 1939 to 1945, involved the Allies and the Axis. Really nothing that's really, new that we haven't known out of these. This is what the who made up the Axis. The Allies, the U.S., Britain, France, New Zealand, India, Soviet Union, China. And then when we look at the Axis, it's going to be primarily Germany, Italy, and Japan. So the day after FDR became president, Hitler came to power and promised to fix the severe economic problems of the Weimar Republic and restore national pride that had been battered after the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles. Japan actually had signed an anti-communist pact with Germany and Mussolini in Italy. At first, the United States didn't really take an aggressive stance on this. They were kind of looking to be a little bit more isolationist, even though they were still aware of some of the fanaticism and some of the things that were happening in Europe. We're going to talk about the European theater, and we're also going to talk about the Pacific theater, so we can kind of get on the same page when I'm talking about Pacific and European and all that stuff. So, but we still had an isolationist type of view here in the United States, where about 94% of Americans at that time in 1937 did not think we should get involved, which is interesting, right? When the Japanese sank the American gunboat, the USS Panay in Chinese water, still the opinion remained isolationist. Japan apologized and took steps which appeared to signal kind of a movement toward peace. Keep U.S. out of war. Let's be neutral. This is a picture of the USS Panay being sunk. Originally, like I said, when the United States tried to remain isolationist, they had something passed that was attempted to be passed called the Ludlow Amendment. And basically what the Ludlow Amendment was, it was an amendment to the Constitution that would require a national referendum when we would need to declare war on somebody, right? So if there was an aggressive action and we needed to declare war against a country, in a sense, we would have to go out and exercise our right to vote to allow the United States to get into some type of armed conflict, right? Or a declaration of war. This was 21 votes short of passing. So, something that might have really affected us. Obviously, we haven't declared war since World War II. Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf War, the War on Terror were all done by military actions, which were all approved by Congress and not a declaration of war. This is Louis Ludlow. So we started to see in the European theater the Axis gaining momentum. Hitler ran through Austria, demanded a large part of Czechoslovakia. Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia in 1939. Franco from Spain and Mussolini and the Japanese were also on the march. In May, Germany and Italy started a military alliance, so we could see the Axis powers really gaining momentum. On the first day of September in 1939, Germany invaded Poland. England and France had pledged to support the Poland. As a result, they declared war 2 days later. At that time, America only had 174,000 soldiers, as compared to Germany, who had 12 million. So another thing that was a little bit concerning. We started to see the war spread in the European theater. During the spring of 1940, Nazi troops rode through Denmark, Norway, and the Low Countries in France. They practiced something called blitzkrieg. So if there's any football fans out there, this is where the term blitz comes from, where a little bit opposite, where the defense sends a bunch of rushers to try to sack the quarterback. In this case, a blitzkrieg is more offensive as opposed to defensive, right? You lightning war, where you go out and attack with a lot of ferocity, right? Great Britain, who was the next target, was sued, fighting for those lives, and the Germans were right on the brink of crossing into Great Britain, but were prevented by the English Canal. And here we could see the English Channel. And then we could see here the German occupied zone, right on the doorstep of France, just being blocked out by the English Channel. As a result of the Nazis' triumphs in the European theater, in the Pacific theater, the Japanese moved in strategic portions of northern French Indochina, which is Vietnam today, and they signed a treaty of alliance with Germany and Italy. Still, as a result of this, we still had a really strong feelings toward isolationism, especially among German and Irish ethnic groups, college students, and Republicans. Here is another map of the Japanese expansion before Pearl Harbor. And when we started to get on our path to war in 1941, Roosevelt asked for $7 billion to lend and lease war supplies to any country who they thought might need it and whose defense deemed necessary for the defense of the United States as well. This was known as the Lend-Lease Act of 1941. He wanted to make America the arsenal of democracy, and after a furious battle in Congress, aid finally started to begin to flow to England. And now it was really evident that the United States was on the side of the Allies. Hitler, in June of 1941, violated his alliance with Stalin, Joseph Stalin, and attacked the Soviet Union. And both the British and American governments promised to help resist the aggression, and $1 billion in aid was soon on its way. On September 4th, the destroyer USS Greer was attacked by a German sub. It was tracking off the coast of Iceland. As a result of this, FDR declared that American ships had the ability to shoot on sight all German subs found between Iceland and North America. So tensions were running high. And here's a picture of the USS Greer. Then Pearl Harbor happened, right? What caused Pearl Harbor to happen? In July of 41, the Japanese moved into southern Indochina. FDR was hopeful that economic pressure would restrain Japan, as all of their assets were frozen in the United States, ending trade between the two nations. The Dutch governor of the East Indies also cut off an oil supply to the Japanese, which really angered them. The Japanese military and government Monterey waged a heated debate about the nation's future foreign policy, and as a result of this, Japan started to plan an attack on the U.S. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, which is known as the Day of Infamy, George C. Marshall, who was chief of staff at the time, sent a warning to, based on an intercepted code, to Hawaii and several other strategic locations. The telegram to Hawaii was delayed after its arrival and didn't reach the military until the bombs were already dropped on Pearl Harbor, which was home of the Pacific Fleet and a lot of battleships and aircraft carriers at the time. It sank 21 American warships, destroyed 165 planes, and killed 2,338 military and civilian personnel. That number was eclipsed on 9/11, so we could see, kind of the atrocity and some of the really hardships that came out of that. The sinking of the Arizona, which is now a memorial site in Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, took the lives of 1,177 crewmen. In retrospect, it didn't really hurt the U.S., but gave them a reason to get into the war. And here's a picture. As a result, citizens went to work, right, to help the war effort. Rations, rationing car parts, rationing steel. At this time, we had manpower shortages hastened by the draft and the need for defense workers, which actually allowed women to get into the workforce. And in 1943, wartime employment peaked by more than 12.5 million people working in basic war industries. And as you can see, this is also stimulating our economy and helping out with the bad economic cycle that we just experienced during the Great Depression. Military-wise, the selective service gives the total inductions during World War II, or the total number of people drafted, at 11,535,000. That would be right around somewhere around 20% of drafted based on registration. 38.8 were volunteers, and 61.2 were draftees. Our economy grew. Government services were needed. Government purchased goods and services reached $89 billion in 1944. And profits rose. And about half of our annual production went to the war effort. Women started working outside the home, from 14 million to 19 million. Again, I think it's really understated the contributions that women made in the workforce during the war. Here's a nice picture of that. Minorities also made a very real contribution. Even though we had a bunch of Japanese Americans placed in internment camps under Executive Order 9066, even though a lot of them were, some of them were second, third generation Americans, they were still placed in the camps. African Americans were still discriminated against. And this is a picture of the Tuskegee Airmen, which I don't know if you know the story about these, but read about it. It's a really incredible, harrowing story. Native American Code Talkers, it's another interesting story. There's a Nicolas Cage movie about it if you want to watch it, but there's also some very good documentaries out there. Okay, now let's go back to the Pacific Theater. Hitler was attacking Great Britain and the Soviet Union simultaneously and threatened to take over the whole of Europe. This posed obviously a danger to the Western Hemisphere. In November of 1942, Allied troops fought the Germans out of North Africa. Italy's army finally collapsed. In Sicily, Mussolini was driven from power, and Allied troops quickly moved into Italy, facing powerful German forces. Now, we also started to become a little bit more knowledgeable about the Holocaust, according to who you want to maybe look at and whose documentations you believe to be more accurate. There's beliefs that the Allies were aware of the Holocaust in 1944, and they were even preparing war crimes indictments against Hitler and his top Nazi commanders. But there are also secret documents that the League of Nations and the UN later found out that they knew of the camps as early as 1942. So, a little bit of a disagreement between these two dates. One of the more horrific things that happened in our world history. And it would have been a lot less tragic if we would have done something to stop it in 1942. But soon Europe was to be liberated, right? Germans breached France and also were moving toward the Great Britain, but the English Channel prevented the Germans from moving supplies into Great Britain. The Battle of Normandy, which happened on June 6, 1944, which is detailed in the movie Saving Private Ryan, resulted in Allied liberation of Western Europe from the Nazi control. The surprise attack on the beach of Normandy involved 3 million men, 4,000 landing craft, 600 warships, and some 11,000 aircraft. The Allied losses were horrendous, especially among the Americans at Omaha Beach. And this was one of the largest scale assaults in the history of the world and required extensive planning. Here is a picture of a boat coming off of June 6, 1944, where a lot of these people who were maybe not much older than you all, 2021, were in the midst of a battle. On July 25th, following the devastating air bombardment, the First Army broke through German lines. Paris was liberated, and by October, Americans were pushing into German soil. And on May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allies, bringing an end to the European conflict in World War II. In the Pacific Theater, Japanese struck quickly after Pearl Harbor, taking Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong in December, and Singapore and Java in 1942. American Marines landed in Guadalcanal in August of 1942, and there was a fierce struggle that lasted 6 months before the Japanese conceded defeat. The Allies invaded the Marshall Islands, the Admiralty Islands, Hollandia and Dutch New Guinea, the Marianas, the Palos, and the Philippines. In October, the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines gave control of the Pacific to the Allies. The Japanese lost a lot of people. Over 50,000 died in the effort to retain the Marianas. And in 2 days of the Battle of Philippine Seas, the Japanese lost 3 carriers and about 400 planes. The savage fighting on the tiny Pacific island of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in the battle in the spring of 1945 told how bloody the invasion would be. The Marines suffered 20,000 casualties at Iwo Jima, and this always is a very important thing to me because my grandfather was actually a corpsman in the Navy and was attached to a Marine outfit and fought on the Battle of Iwo Jima. So seeing this picture always reminds me of my grandfather and what he fought in the war, and he never talked about it. I would ask him about it. He would never go into details. So I was, hold this in such high regard because it reminds me of my grandfather. Atomic bombs were eventually dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, which led to the end of the war. The World War killed about 322,000 Americans, injured about 800,000, and this pales into comparison, however, of the tens of million people that were lost in Europe and Asia. Russia lost about 26 million people, and close to 50 million people died in the Holocaust. So, something that is an important part of our history, but we also need to understand the losses. Okay, guys, take a look at the next video on the Cold War. There'll be a separate video on the Electoral College and also the Great Depression. Okay, we'll see you soon.